Can you guys hear okay? And are you seeing the title slide? Thumbs up, Sandra.
Yes, I'm seeing your title slide.
Excellent. Just wanted to double check before I take off to the races here.
Okay.
We've got about 50 minutes worth of things to cover in about 45 minutes today, I think, folks. So we're going to move through a variety of topics. But I also wanted to let you guys know that throughout the presentation, I'm going to ask y'all for your feedback at various points. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. One, you can go online to the website that you see there, pollev.com // Sarah Lancaster 648. You can text a message to 37607. So that would be the number that you're texting to, and the message that you will send is that Sarah Lancast 648. Alternatively, it would be okay to use the chat or the Q&A, probably the Q&A feature as well, or probably the chat feature rather as well, just to interact, guys. But I'd really prefer if we did the online or the text versions here. Easy breezy. So you guys can hopefully be working on that. That information will also be presented as we approach those questions on the slides. So like I said, we've got a lot to cover. We're going to start with some information on a couple of regulatory things that are causing a lot of concerns for folks. And then we're going to move through to, as Sandra mentioned, talking about some of the kind of hows and whys associated with just getting through what is likely to be a very challenging year. So the first regulatory update here is kind of the older of the two updates that I want to talk about up front. And that is just to make everyone aware that the EPA had been saying for most of the fall that we should expect an announcement on labels for 2022 anytime, probably sometime around Thanksgiving. What ended up happening was they made a statement on December 15th. And really there wasn't a lot of information or a lot of decisions in that statement. They did talk about the fact that there were a lot of potential additional restrictions discussed with various stakeholders throughout the summer and fall of 2021. They talked about the fact that as the EPA works with individual states to customize those over-the-top Dicamba labels for XtendiMax, Ingenia, and Tavium, that they would be likely to approve state-specific changes that would further restrict those labels, but that they are not likely to approve state-level changes that would expand those labels or, for example, extend that application date that is currently in place. So we have tentative guidance for 2022. I say tentative because from the EPA standpoint, it is what we have. However, as we saw in 2021, we know that courts can make interesting decisions, and the Ninth Circuit Court does have a case related to Dicamba on their docket still. So hopefully we can get through the growing season without any major upheavals there. The other comment to make here is that the Endangered Species Act is playing a role in the how we work through the Dicamba registration. The EPA is still conducting some of their evaluations related to Dicamba, as well as products like glyphosate and atrazine and Paraquat. So the topic or the regulatory update that is most recent and that has really caused a lot of concern for farmers, especially those folks in Southeast Kansas, is the fact that the EPA in early January did announce a new 7-year label for Enlist herbicides, which on its face is very good news. We knew that those labels were set to expire on January 12th. And so the EPA did get those labels out ahead of that deadline. There are some additional application requirements that folks are going to want to make sure they see, some restrictions on growth stages for the crops, as well as some expectations that users will use some soil conservation practices in order to prevent runoff of 2,4-D if there are major rain events. And so it's not a totally new feature of the labels. It's just a expanded requirements associated with the language around not allowing runoff on those labels. What is causing big concerns with the enlist labels is that there are 10 counties in the state of Kansas in which we cannot use enlist. And that is because of a little insect called a burying beetle, which is on the endangered species list. So again, those 10 counties are all in the southeast part of the state. And, you know, the things that we're going to talk about today in terms of handling herbicide shortages also apply to folks in this situation where they've had a key herbicide for their, in most of these folks' case, water hemp management programs, basically taken out of their toolbox. So we need to keep an eye, folks, on this Endangered Species Act, because every herbicide, fungicide, and insecticide that goes through this re-registration process, which is all of them over the course of time, is going to be subject to enforcement of the Endangered Species Act. And so we could see more things of this nature popping up, and we need to have, you know, good, the terminology we use is mitigation strategies in place to make sure we can use all the tools that we need to effectively manage weeds. Okay, so now let's transition into what in my little world has really been a big topic throughout the fall and this winter. And that is, how are herbicide shortages going to impact how farmers do business? So I have a question for you guys. This is the first of those questions, and it looks like some folks found it on the website and have already answered. That's fantastic. Which herbicides are you most concerned about being available during 2022? So I've got an answer here of Roundup. Someone said it's not applicable. Okay, we've got Liberty. That's a very common answer. All of those glyphosate formulations. Very good. We'll give this just a few more seconds here to see what else comes in. So the way this word cloud is working is that, as you see, Roundup just got a little bit bigger. So that means some more people put Roundup in as their answer. So as folks answer, the bigger the word, the more answers it represents. So, all right, so all the usual suspects listed there: glyphosate formulations, Liberty, Paraquat. I have heard a few mentions of that. Okay, so as we think about moving into 2022, you know, I just really want to encourage you guys to think like a coach. All right, so John Wooden, probably one of the best basketball coaches of all times, his number one thing when he started practice with his boys every fall was to make sure they knew how to tie their shoes. Okay, and that goes to saying that just like John Wooden can't control what team shows up as the opposing team, he can control the little things that his team does on a daily basis. Okay, so no, guys, I don't have any, you know, silver bullets or magic answers here. Just some reminders to be, you know, good weed managers, some things to think about in terms of herbicide alternatives, and just, you know, a word of encouragement that we can control what we can control, and we're going to get through 2022, bumps and bruises and all. So first thing to think about, weed management 101. Guys, we're going back to the basics here, starting clean. Okay, whatever that looks like for your operation. If you are used to using a chemical burn down, a herbicide burn down in the spring, I would suggest to you that this is going to be an easier place to replace glyphosate in your weed management system than trying to replace glyphosate in crop. So we'll look at some options for replacing glyphosate in your burn down herbicide application. Second on the list, apply full rates. One of the caveats to that, you know, we've kind of come to think of a full rate of Roundup as being like that 32 ounce or that quart rate of Roundup. But this might be a place once we get in crop that we could think about trying to stretch that glyphosate that we do have. So rather than going out at that higher rate, just think about glyphosate as going after your grasses. Okay, so apply those lower rates, that 24, 27 ounce rate, to get the grasses in your system. You know, anecdotally, we probably gain some things by having glyphosate, fully loaded glyphosate formulations in the tank, in terms of herbicide efficacy that increases as a result of that proprietary surfactant system. Okay, you're still going to get that if you put that in there at the grass rate, and you're going to, at the same time, like I said, be able to stretch your glyphosate supply. That being said, I don't know that it's a good idea. Actually, it is not a good idea to try to stretch your supply of other herbicides in general by cutting rates, right? We have seen what reduced rate herbicide applications do, and generally it's just poor weed control. Okay, the name of the game here is to reduce the number of post-emergence herbicide applications that we need to make. So we want excellent control with that first post-emergence herbicide pass. Last two bullet points there: apply in ideal conditions and apply to small, actively growing weeds. That's nothing new. And I know that every person listening to this webinar is doing the best they can to do those two things every time out. One thing I will say, though, is that, you know, when apply that small, actively growing weeds piece, it's important to remember how quickly some of these weeds, particularly our pigweeds, can get away from us when it's warm and wet. And so scouting, boots on the ground, in the field scouting, is something that could potentially pay bigger than normal dividends this summer, just in terms of trying to make sure that we're maximizing the effectiveness of those applications that include glyphosate or glufosinate. All right, next question here. What portion of your herbicides have you already purchased? It's been kind of fun for me to ask this question and see, you know, as we get closer to the spring, how folks are getting closer to being ready. So. We'll give this just a couple more seconds. See how things settle out. All right, so it looks like most of us are in pretty good shape. Now, the reason I asked that question is because as we started thinking about these concerns about product availability, one of the first pieces of advice we had was to take delivery as soon as possible, okay? Being realistic about what you need and trying to get it in your possession as soon as possible, because, you know, prepay is great for, you know, managing your books, but not so great for ensuring that you have the product that you need. Now, the general rule of thumb here with herbicide storage, if you're not used to storing product over the winter, the kind of generic term we talk about is just storing it in a, quote, cool, dry place. But if you dig into the herbicide labels, you'll see that there are actually there's actually quite a bit of variability in terms of how these products should be stored. Okay, so we've got a table here listing various temperatures that are provided on some of these herbicide labels, and then herbicides that can be stored in those various conditions. A few things I want to point out. Number one, look where the Roundup Power Max and Roundup Ultra formulations fall on this table. Okay, they're in this no restrictions category. Okay, so if you've been hesitant because you don't have heated storage, yes, heated storage is ideal, but it's not essential for having those herbicides on hand over the winter. Another thing to point out, look here at the top, that above 32 degrees, okay, Gramoxone 2.0, those old 2-pound formulations of Gramoxone, which are still out there and available, they cannot be stored below freezing. But if you come down here to the no restrictions, those newer 3-pound formulations of Gramoxone can be stored at temperatures below freezing. So that just goes to the point that we need to make sure that we're checking the label for the particular formulation that we have, so that we know for sure what the specifics are. The other one to point out, would just be this idea that some of these products need to be thawed and then recirculated well before they're used. I chuckle a little bit when I have to read about thawing a herbicide before you put it into a spray tank. That's kind of goes without saying, but rules exist for a reason. So recirculating overwintered herbicides. If you're not used to storing these products over the winter, what you're going to find is that herbicides are a suspension, really. We talk about them as being a solution, but chemically they're really a suspension. And so what that means is that those herbicide formulations are going to settle out, and the different components of that formulation will end up in different layers of, for example, a mini bulk tank. Okay. And so recirculating can help, but if you have a tank that has been sitting over winter, just recirculating with a pump is not going to get the job done in order to get all of that product back into suspension. So the best way to do that is with an air wand. You don't need a lot of pressure. 10 to 20 PSI is going to be good. And basically you're going to use that air wand to just lift the herbicide off the bottom of that spray tank. Okay, so you're just looking visually to see that you've got all of any settled product off of the bottom. You're also looking to see that there are no layers in the surface. Oftentimes some of the lighter, the less dense liquid components will rise to the top. So you want to make sure all those layers are redistributed throughout the tank. The other thing to think about here, just as a kind of a disclaimer, is that none of these mini bulk tanks are pressure rated. Okay, so that's why using lower pressure is important. And also make sure that you're providing adequate venting so that your tank doesn't build up pressure on the inside, and you could end up with a big mess there. All right, next thing to think about as we dive into actual herbicide selection considerations here. Number one, flexibility. We all know that raising a crop requires a lot of, I just watched the Chiefs not play so well last night, calling a lot of audibles, right? We have to be flexible. And so one of those ways we have to be flexible is to consider looking for premixes that contain the active ingredient that we're after. Okay, so for example, looking for premixes that also contain glyphosate. Okay, we're kind of in this mindset that sometimes the most economical way to get the product is to just get a generic version of the straight goods. But in this case, we might need to look for premixes. You can see a list here on this slide. One caveat that I will tell you is that, one of the things I think I remember from my economics classes many moons ago is that as demand increases for a product, right, and then that product comes off of the market or becomes unavailable, that is going to increase demand for the substitute goods. Okay, so as we see increased demand, for example, for for glyphosate, we're going to see increased demands for Acheron GT. And that means that some of these premixes are already becoming hard to get a hold of or have increased in price as well. Okay. But again, looking at all of the options, this is something that is important. The one item on here that I did want to share just a little bit of data for you guys on is a product called Sinate. It is a premix of Impact and Liberty. So it could be another way to get your Liberty. These are some data that came from our weed control trials last year, which 2021 was the first year that we included Sinate in the weed control guide. So it's still maybe a product that's not as familiar to some folks. So you can see that Sinate does bring quite a bit to the table in terms of grass control. All right, thinking about alternative formulations for soybeans. Again, you can see a list there with glyphosate as well as glufosinate. One thing to say here is that a lot of these formulations, a lot of these premixes are going to have some residual activity with that premix partner there. And so that can be a good way to add that layered residual piece to your weed management program, which we'll talk about more in just a little bit. And the other thing that I need to say here is that I know we're talking probably to a lot of folks from the western part of the state. And so, probably this FlexStar GT with fomeciphin is probably not the best option for you guys just because of the rotation restrictions that we pick up with on that label as we move to the western part of the state. The next thing to think about here would be considering some alternative active ingredients. Okay, so when you can't get the glyphosate, what are we looking for? All right, so thinking about Burndown. As we think about non-selective weed control, once we get past glyphosate, probably the next herbicide that most weed scientists think of is Paraquat. Okay, one of the things that we know about Paraquat, if you choose to use this for your Burndown, is that we tend to see a little bit better activity when we combine Paraquat with a group 5 herbicide like atrazine, if you're going to corn or soybeans, or I'm sorry, corn or sorghum, or metribuzin if you're going to soybeans. Okay, that increases the effectiveness and it also gives us some residual activity. The other thing we need to think about for Paraquat is that because of some of those human health concerns, there are some extra training requirements for Paraquat. A couple of things about those training requirements. One is that it's for anyone that handles the product, not just the applicators. Anyone that's handling the product needs to be a certified applicator, so you need to have an applicator's license, and you need to have this additional training, the Paraquat specific training. The other thing to say about this is that potentially we could be running up on some folks that have reached the limit of their 3-year certificate. So some of the product specific training that we have is good for a year and has to be renewed every year. In the case of Paraquat, we need to have that training renewed every 3 years. Okay, it is done online and you can see the link here on this website. So looking at, in particular, grass control here with some glyphosate alternatives. You see on the far right-hand side of this chart, you can see quizalofop, which is Assure, and clethodim, which is Select. They give excellent control of grasses. The next best alternative here is Paraquat. In this particular study, it's coming in around 70%. There are some data that suggests that if you put metribuzin in with that Paraquat, you're going to bump that control up to the mid-90s ranges for winter cereals. So just evidence there of the importance of including that group 5 product with Paraquat. Some other options to think about, Sharpen or Verdict, which is a premix that contains Sharpen and Outlook. A third product here, or rather a fourth product here that we just added to the weed control guide in 2022 is a product called Reviton. Reviton is a chemical cousin to Sharpen. So it's going to behave very similarly to Sharpen. You can see the use rates there are generally 1 to 2 fluid ounces per acre. And truth be told, as far as grass control in particular, it does look a little better when it goes out with some glyphosate. So again, maybe not a perfect substitute, but definitely something to be looking at ahead of corn or soybeans. The last item on the list there sounds like a good idea in theory. Okay, group 4 herbicides are products like 2,4-D and Dicamba. They control broadleaves. Group 1 herbicides are products like Assure and Select. They control grasses. In theory, controlling broadleaves and controlling grasses gives us good broad spectrum weed control. The problem with this is that those group 1 herbicides like Assure and Select are very, very prone to antagonism. Okay, so when we apply those herbicides like Assure and Select, when we tank mix them with other products, in particular with those group 4 herbicides like 2,4-D, we see reduced grass control. Okay, so if you have a situation, a burn down situation where you're going after bigger grasses or very dense stands of grass, tank mixing 2,4-D with one of these grass herbicides is not going to be a good solution. Okay, you're very likely to see reduced control because of this antagonism, which is going to be enhanced or made worse by the fact that those group 1 herbicides typically don't perform very well in cool, cloudy conditions. And we see a lot of cool, cloudy conditions in the spring. So not a good choice. If to try to go after grasses and broadleaves in the same tank mix and do this. This is not a recommendation because I think you're setting yourself up for potentially very disappointing grass control. Ask the folks who were trying to control volunteer corn in their enlist and extend soybeans last summer when the corn got too big, and they were just throwing some select in with their enlist or extend a max or ingenia applications. Okay, so not a recommendation, but if you want to do this, some things to think about. Maximize the rate of that grass herbicide. Okay, you can increase the rate of the grass herbicide. Optimize the adjuvant system. So take a look at the label for your particular product and use the adjuvants, the surfactants according to those labeled guidelines. Other things to think about, the only management practice or only application practice that has been shown to effectively prevent antagonism with these types of tank mixes 100% of the time is to not do it. There's quite a lot of data that exists from, a lot of it's from the 90s, the early 90s, looking at these tank mixes and how to overcome that antagonism. And sometimes things help, sometimes things don't, just as a function of the environment or the condition of the plant. But the only thing that works effectively is to apply them separately. Okay, so things to think about would be to apply the graminicide. And then, ideally, we'd want to come back maybe 3 to 7 days later with our broadleaf herbicide. But just get that grass herbicide into the plant and get it time to be moving through the plant. So at least a day, 24 hours. But give that grass herbicide time to be fully absorbed and then come back with your broadleaf herbicide. Okay, the broadleaf control generally is not affected by these tank mixes. It's the grass control that we lose when we use these tank mixes. Thinking about alternative products for grass control in corn, really the things to look at are the ALS inhibitors, nicosulfuron and rimsulfuron. And then other things to think about would be some of the group 27 herbicides like dipramazone or timbatrione. Okay. Those are the options that we might want to look at there. Thinking about broadleaf weed control in soybeans. Okay, really, there's a reason that the guys are liking the enlist and the extend systems, and that's because Dicamba and 2,4-D are still effective on our driver weeds like the pigweeds. Okay, if those two products become not an option, we're back to managing weeds like we did in the early 1990s. Okay, and I am old enough to remember the stories of how ineffective some of these herbicides were on things like red root pigweed, let alone on things like palm or amaranth. Okay, we also have to think about the crop response with these herbicides. So group 14 herbicides like Blazer and Cobra. Okay, again, FlexStar actually is probably one of the more effective options, but because of those rotation restrictions, once you get out west, really, that's not on the table for a lot of folks that may be listening to this webinar today. The other thing to remember along the lines of being flexible is to increase residual herbicide use. Okay, I know that there are only so many dollars to put into your weed control budget, but one of the best places you can spend them is on a residual herbicide, because we don't have to worry about a post-emergence herbicide application for a weed that never comes up. Okay. As we think about using residual herbicides, we're still looking for multiple effective modes of action. We've been talking multiple effective modes of action kind of with an emphasis on post products to manage herbicide resistance for many years now, but that concept applies to residual herbicides as well. The other thing we want to think about if you're trying to build a pre-emergence herbicide program is to think about the water solubility and the half-life of those products. So how easy is it for that herbicide to get into solution so that the weeds can take it up and then die? And how long is that product going to stick around? Okay, so on this table, you can see the products in red tend to have a little higher water solubility, which indicates that they should take a little less water to get into solution. And the third column You're looking at a measurement there called the half-life. And that's not saying that, for example, for acetochlor products, that's not saying that in 12 days you're going to lose half of your herbicide effectiveness. What that's saying is that in general, acetochlor is going to have a half-life. It's going to remain in the soil about half as long as metolachlor. Okay. It's not saying that you're going to lose half of your activity in those days. It's just looking at the relative amount of time that those herbicides are going to stick around in the soil. Okay, so thinking about picking at least one product that has a longer half-life, a longer period of activity in the soil to get you through to that overlapping residual or that layered residual application, or to get you through to canopy closure. And that brings me to the next point, which would be to consider layered residual herbicides. So a lot of folks are using layered residual herbicides. And I think as I look at the time, in the interest of time, we're going to skip this particular polling question. Generally speaking, when I ask this, most folks are using residual herbicides in most of their post-emergence herbicide applications. So that's good news for extension programming. And the message is getting across. I do want to share this particular piece of data, though. This data set comes out of the University of Nebraska, and they were looking at applying Warrant, 2.5 quarts of Warrant at 2-week intervals with various combinations of application dates. So 2 weeks ahead of planting, at planting, and then the E-post was 2 weeks after planting, and the late post was 4 weeks after planting, okay? And so the thing I wanted to drive home here, yes, we would love for you guys to go out, 21 to 28 days after after your pre-emergence herbicide application with this layered residual application. But the takeaway from this data is that, whether they went out 2 or 4 weeks after application, they had similar season-long weed control, okay? And then adding a second layered herbicide application didn't change the results, okay? So what I want to say here is to give you guys a little bit of reassurance that if you miss that target date by a few days because of a rain event, all is not lost. Make sure you're controlling what's up and get that residual back out there. Other things to think about, you'll hear from Dorvar and Peter later in this series about the importance of soil testing this year. I'm just certain. I want to emphasize the importance of water testing, especially areas that have hard water, to make sure that you're getting the right amount of AMS in your spray solutions to neutralize those cations, those minerals that float around in the water. Also thinking about the pH of your water is going to be important, especially if you're using sulfonylurea herbicides, those group 2 or ALS inhibiting herbicides. All right, I think in the interest of time, we'll skip this one as well. I want to talk about spray volume. Okay, we mentioned Paraquat a little bit ago. Paraquat and Liberty are examples of 2 herbicides that absolutely do require higher spray volumes. Okay, we can get by with maybe 10 or 15 GPA spray volumes with things like 2,4-D and Roundup. But as we start thinking about those contact herbicides, they need the coverage, they need more water. And I want to share this slide with you guys, not so much to talk about the data per se, but just to give you a visual in case you haven't really thought about it for a while as to what increasing that spray volume does. Okay, so you're looking there at what happens on the top row. You've got 10 gallons per acre, the middle is 15, bottom is 20. Okay, so just a good visual for what happens to the droplets that are going to be on the surface of those weeds trying to get that herbicide in. Okay. The next thing we need to talk about here is just general good equipment maintenance. Okay, as you go through your machines for the spring and making sure that they're ready to run, one of the things not to forget is spray tips. I skipped past the polling question asking you guys, how often do you replace spray tips? It's been interesting to see folks' answers to that question because they range from every year to some folks seriously were telling me that they only change spray tips when they change out their sprayers. Okay, so things to think about. As those spray tips wear, the distribution of the herbicide within the pattern of that's coming out of that tip changes. Okay, that's why we start to see streaks in the field as our spray tips wear out, because we need that even distribution to account for that 50% overlap that we were aiming for when we set our boom height. Okay. Other things to think about. Being a good agronomist, crop rotation is important. Fertility, I know that is a contentious issue this year as well. Planting dates. As we think about moving planting dates earlier, which is a trend for both corn and soybeans for a lot of reasons that I'm not going to argue with, what I want you guys to think about, though, is that as you move that planting date earlier, it's important to make sure that you're not kind of outrunning your pre-emergence herbicide, because those herbicides are going on earlier. And so they may or may not still be around when our target weeds like Palmer amaranth are starting to emerge later in the season. So staying on top of those layered residual herbicides becomes increasingly important as we think about moving planting dates earlier. Plant population, row spacing can also be effective. Increasing plant population, decreasing row spacing are all ways to make our crops more competitive and to reduce the pressure on those post-emergence herbicide applications. Other things to think about would be non-chemical alternatives. So things like, maybe strategic tillage is something you want to put in your toolbox. Cover crops are something, particularly in the eastern side of the state, that is becoming more popular. And honestly, guys, you might get a chuckle when I say electrocution and flaming, but even though, I'm one of those folks that 25 years ago, I would have said that's for organic farmers, that's not for conventional farmers. We're seeing a lot more conventional weed scientists take an interest in collecting data on these types of non-chemical operations just for worst case scenarios, okay, so that we're prepared. If you choose to use covers, one of the things that we know is that we need biomass to get weed suppression, and that generally speaking, the grasses are going to give us the greatest biomass. The most consistent benefit that we get from covers is that it slows down weed growth. Okay, it's just going to slow down the growth of those weeds. Cover crops are not a silver bullet for weed control. Another factor that makes cover crops not a silver bullet for weed control is the fact that you have to terminate them. And generally speaking, herbicides are one of the most common ways to terminate cover crops. And glyphosate, as you can see from these, as I'd like you to see from these red bars here that are all very small and very far to the right-hand side of that graph, it's consistent and it's very effective, okay? We want to pull glyphosate out as an option for cover crop burn down. Based on this data set, which is a pretty robust data set, the next best options are going to be combinations of Paraquat, metribuzin, and 2,4-D, okay? These data were designed to go ahead of a soybean system. That's why the metribuzin is in there instead of something like an atrazine, okay? So as we're thinking about pulling glyphosate out for broad spectrum control of cover crops or weeds, Paraquat plus a group 5 plus 2,4-D provides good results. I've gotten quite a few questions from folks using covers about roller crimpers. I have not done this research, but what the literature suggests is that kind of the magic time is right at the beginning of flowering. Okay. And I just want to put in a caveat here that I understand that cover crops aren't for everybody, and that's a decision that needs to be made carefully on an operation by operation basis. All right, Jeannie and Sandra and others, I think I left some time here for some questions. If folks are interested, here is a QR code for the weed control guide. They can just scan that from their computer screens and it'll take them to the link and they can download that to their mobile device. It's online. They can go to the website. And then you knew this was coming, Jeannie, the plug for the podcast. If you guys like talk radio, we talk to some very interesting folks on the podcast once a week throughout the fall and the winter. So, all right, what questions have been coming in?
Okay, guys, so now go ahead and any questions that you have, go ahead and put in the Q&A box. If you're joining us on YouTube, put it into the chat box over on the side, and then we will have Sarah start answering these for us. I'm not sure if we have any in yet, but Sarah, I'm going to throw one at you to get you started while everybody's typing in here. This is a question that I seem to get pretty often, and when we're thinking about looking at your pictures of spray distribution on the water sensitive paper, we think about Paraquat. And if we are spraying that, what types of gallons per acre should we be looking at to get good coverage of Paraquat, but we don't necessarily want off-target movement of Paraquat?
You know, that 20 gallons per acre range for a lot of these contact herbicides seems to kind of be the sweet spot where we get good coverage, but we don't have a whole lot of those driftable fines that we worry about causing that off-target movement. So, you know, it's spray volume and it's also droplet size, right? So we can manipulate the tips that we're choosing, right, to try to affect droplet size a little bit and reduce that off-target movement. Yeah, that's a great question, Jeannie, because Paraquat drift is so easy to see. Right?
I do get calls to go look at Paraquat drift at times, and you know, it doesn't take a whole lot, it seems like, to move it a fairly large distance when you don't think you have much air movement going on at that point. So
yeah, so again, thinking about that droplet size distribution, so you can get high spray volume and not have tiny droplets that are going to be prone to drift. So using some of those larger orifice sizes to get those larger droplets will be important there.
okay, so I'm looking at the questions here in the Q&A box. I have one from Stan, and it says, will rates of sharpen above 2 ounces increase burn down control of broadleaf weeds, especially on Palmer pigweed? And Sarah's quiet, so I hope she's still there.
I'm still here. I was contemplating that and looking at my helper here in the background, Jeannie. Yeah, so, you know, increasing rates above 2, you can go a little higher, and you are likely to see some enhanced control. One of the concerns you need to think about there, though, is that sharpen does have some residual activity, right? And so we want to increase some of that, but we don't want to increase it to the point where it messes up our crop rotations going forward.
Good deal. Okay. Next question is from Louise. What about biological weed control, especially when cover crops? I'm assuming she means the cover crop seed is so expensive unless you're using it as a graze out.
Yeah, you know, grazing is one of the things that you have to make those cover crop systems work, it seems like. And so biological control is interesting. There aren't a ton of products that are on the market and are available. You know, it's difficult to find products that are sprayable and can be formulated well. And you know, I haven't evaluated any in my system yet. Okay.
Occasionally, I'll also get questions about insects that target specific weeds. And, you know, the one that pops into my mind is musk thistle and the beetles that were going after it, you know, been introduced in several, well, at least a couple of spots in Western Kansas, and occasionally you can still find them out if you're looking in thistles, but don't do a great job, it doesn't seem like, in getting them controlled. So
yeah, the thing about any biological control is that you have to be willing to tolerate a certain level of that weed that you're going after, right? Because those biologicals have to have a host. And not to mention the fact that we figured out through a few bad decisions about biologicals that we need to be pretty careful about which ones we move forward with.
So I'm not sure if you guys can tell, Sarah actually is at home with a sick kiddo today. So if you hear a little extra noise in the background, that's what's going on there. So Erin, do you want to jump in and ask the rest of these questions here? Or Stacy, are you getting any from YouTube?
Yeah, I'll start. Okay, we got one from Marvin, asking for a little more review of termination of rye and chemical choices to do that.
Yeah, let's just jump back to that data set because that's a good data set there, Aaron and Marvin. Good question. So, you know, these were this particular data set is a part of a large study, and they were looking at covers ahead of soybeans, and so they looked at systems that were based on glyphosate, Paraquat, and then Liberty. Okay. And, you know, clearly far and away, the glyphosate systems were the most effective, followed by systems that utilized this Paraquat metribuzin type of combination. Earlier in the talk, I referenced some data that talked about taking rye and wheat control from like 70% up to the mid 90% just by adding metribuzin. Okay, and so this is just, you know, kind of evidence of what you might see here. The thing to beware of, though, to really be wary of, though, here is that you can see the size of these bars indicates the variability in those data, and so that's, you know, that's why glyphosate is good, right? It's a very effective every time. Whereas we have more environment factors when we start looking at some of these other tank mixes that contain Paraquat.
Okay, thank you. Another one popped up in chat, I think, question. Clethodim, MSO or crop oil or NIS?
MSO, crop oil, or what? I'm sorry?
NIS.
NIS. You know, crop oil looks good, NIS looks good. And really it depends on if you're in crop or if you're going for a burn down situation. The NIS is going to be a little bit better for an in crop situation. You have less risk of crop response there as well. So yeah.
Okay. And we'll get our last one in the Q&A box. Will the UNL warrant data be applicable to use in alfalfa?
Marvin, that's a good question. I need to go back and double check what the maximum rate is for warrant in alfalfa. I would be a little bit concerned that you'd be maxing out that labeled rate as far as crop response of that alfalfa. But as we think about seedling alfalfa, yeah, the same principle holds true of just getting it out there so that you can control prevent emergence of some of those in particular grasses and those pigweeds in your alfalfa crop.
And he just replied in the chat, said 40 ounces max warrant, I think. So
Okay, excellent. Excellent.
I think that's all the questions we've got popped up so far. Stacy, do you have anything through YouTube?
I just clicked over and I didn't see anything in the YouTube. If you guys have questions for Sarah, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. Even if we don't get to them, we'll have Sarah get them answered and get stuff back to you on them. Oh, one more. What about allelopathic effects of rye hurting the yields of crops planted after the rye? So the subsequent crops. I always struggle with allelopathy, Sarah.
You know, allelopathy is an interesting thing to talk about because it's so really hard to measure. One of the places we do see allelopathy in the field is when you have that rye ahead of corn in particular. We also see, you know, just full disclosure, we see sometimes issues with insecticides, not insecticides, insects, and how that extra cover from the rye can attract insects that are detrimental to corn production. So, you know, allelopathy can work for us or it can work against us. Sometimes we like to think about rye as being allelopathic because it does contribute some to the weed suppression, but yes, it has been shown to have some effect on some of those crops. But again, it's difficult to pinpoint specifically allelopathy because you have the insect issues, you have soil temperature issues, and a whole host of things that can affect that interaction between the cover crop and the cash crop.
One other note, thanks Sarah on the allelopathy discussion. One other note on the warrant study from UNL, Marvin was wanting to know that if it was 80 ounces or 2.5 quarts. Is that right, Sarah?
It was 2.5 quarts every time they went out. So one of those treatments had 7.5 quarts of warrant that went out over the course of the study. So they were trying to cause some crop response there, trying to see what they could get away with. So
sometimes our goal as weed scientists is not just to get weeds controlled, but to see if we can also cause crop response and other things going on with it. So just because we do this does not always mean that it's on label to do this.
exactly, that would have been, yes, an off-label treatment in that study.
Okay, so guys, we'll go ahead and switch gears just a little bit here. We're right up at time for finishing our presentations here. So thank you, Sarah, for going through all of your presentation, answering our questions as we're going here. For anybody who needs to get their CCA credits, please send me an email, jfalkjones@ksu.edu. I had several of you that sent me the email to start with. Please send me a follow-up email and include your CCA number. I got a couple without CCA numbers at the beginning here, so please go ahead and add those on at the end. So the next thing we're going to ask you to do is to do an evaluation. And I'm sure you guys were all probably thinking that this might be happening, but there is an evaluation we would appreciate you filling out. Here's a QR code that you can scan and it'll open right up into the evaluation. There should be the addresses being put into the chat boxes. And so if you guys would just follow that, honestly, it's not a very long survey. It's just to get a little bit more information from you guys so to help further refine our CropTalk webinar series here. So if you would go in and do those, we would really appreciate the feedback on these, or on this session and on other webinars that you've been on that you think maybe we can benefit from information on. So those should be in the chat boxes at this point, and we would invite you to join us next Monday, also from noon to 1. And this next Monday, we're going to be talking about manure and your soil fertility program. Peter Tomlinson, who is our environmental quality specialist, will be going through talking about manure. How do you manure rates for your ground? What kind of areas you maybe should be getting in a field for manure? And so just kind of an overall discussion on that, just because, well, when we're in high fertilizer prices, sometimes we start outside for other opportunities for weed control or for fertility options on that. So with that, I think we are done for the day. We really appreciate you guys joining us with this. I apologize that we were a little bit rough there at the beginning. I had a lot of echoing going on my side of things. And so we were a little bit of a rough start, but I think we got it figured out now. So thank you guys all for joining us. If you have any questions, please give us your feedback. Or any more questions for Sarah, we'll get those sent into her. So with that, I think we are all done. So thanks for joining us.